Shana Tova, a good year. It is customary to cross the threshold of the new year by looking back at the year that has passed, to hold up the moments of joy and success, to lament the failures, to mourn the losses, to hold all of these experiences collectively in our mind's eye before venturing into imagining what the new year might bring, indeed hoping for and wishing each other a happy and sweet and a prosperous new year. Just a little over a year ago, I stood on this bima on Rosh Hashanah and spoke about the need for us to re-engage with each other as we began to emerge from the pandemic, learning anew the language of community and being together without fear and angst. Like many of my colleagues, I felt exhausted and battered by the storm of the worldwide pandemic and yearned for some goodness and renewed energy for myself, for our community, for our people, and indeed for the world. The rude awakening came on a quiet Shabbat morning, just as the joy of dancing with the Torah the night before was still ringing in my ears. Over 1,200 people, women, children, elderly, mostly civilians, but some soldiers, mostly Jewish, but some foreign workers and Bedouin and Israeli Arabs, were brutally murdered on Simchat Torah, a festival whose very name contains the word joy. Murdered as part of a coordinated attack by Gazan Special Forces units who trained for months for this kind of a mission, but also by many others who could easily be seen as bystanders, who gleefully joined in the rampage of the day, documenting their every brutal move with high-definition cameras they carried on their bodies and helmets, producing hours and hours of footage so chilling, so traumatizing, that journalists and community leaders who have seen some of this footage have reported what is likely to cause permanent, irreversible psychological damage just from seeing the footage. The 1,200 plus murdered constitute by far the largest number of Jews killed in one day since the end of the Holocaust. I will let that sink in. The largest number of Jews intentionally murdered in one day because they were Jewish since the Holocaust. No one was spared from this brutality. Not the Thai workers standing in the fields, not the Arab youths attending the music festival under attack, not parents of young children, not pregnant women, not babies. It filled the attackers with joy. At least one is captured on camera calling his mother from the phone of the family he just executed, his voice filled with glee and pride. "I murdered Jews," he yells. As we reeled in shock, checking in with family members and friends, checking the news and trying to understand the enormity of what was unfolding, a petition was gaining traction on the Harvard campus, supported by some 30 of the student groups, laying blame at Israel's feet. University professors elsewhere declared exhilaration, and logos of winged paratroopers were worn with pride on American campuses as signs of resistance worthy of celebration. Then, after all that, came the war and the destruction with its painful, slow progress. Yes, Israel has a strong army that knows how to wage war when attacked. The promise of a country of our own was, after all, that no one would be able to simply murder Jews whenever they wanted to and suffer no consequences. Thousands of Hamas fighters have been killed so far, and thousands of civilians have become what is known in war as collateral damage, an awful phrase describing an equally awful concept that is inevitable in war. Then came marchers in major European and American cities chanting from the river to the sea and calling for global intifada, attacking Jews on the streets and in synagogues and community buildings and Hillels. The campus protests, the banning of Jews from campuses by people insisting they have the freedom of speech on their side, even as they refuse to let others speak. I don't need to tell you the story. We have all lived through this year and continue living through this year. And then there are hostages. Release of some of them have been negotiated in exchange for a temporary ceasefire. A few others have been rescued through daring raids and Israeli soldiers taking on tremendous risks and losing their lives in the process. Some bodies recovered, including the 6 hostages who were executed just a few weeks ago at point blank as the Israeli forces were getting close to rescuing them after 11 months in horrendous conditions of captivity. The very idea that they could be rescued led to their execution. Rambam, Maimonides, when writing in the 12th century, insists that releasing the captives is a mitzvah, a Jewish commandment that takes precedence over every other mitzvah. The 16th century Codex of Shulchan Aruch, the definitive work of Halakha, the Jewish religious law, reiterates it. Our daily morning blessings, including the one that we recited this morning, contain one for the release of the captives, as does the daily Amidah. Now, I want us to understand these are not theoretical prayers just to make sure we got all bases covered, wishing for a good year or something else lovely and nice. It is a pain and trauma carried by our people who have for centuries seen their fellow Jews captured and held for ransom, and who have made it a priority to pray for, work for, and give up much of their hard-earned personal and communal equity in order to rescue fellow Jews whom they did not know. It is a religious obligation installed within our tradition to do everything we can to rescue Jews. I have never met Kfir Bibas, nor do I know his family, but every time I close my eyes, I see this red-headed baby whose first birthday was spent in the dungeons of Hamas, and who remains there almost a year later, his fate still unknown. As we approach the first anniversary of October 7th, I have to tell you what you already know. This has been the most difficult year for the Jewish people in most of our lifetimes. I'm not trying to be dramatic or looking for a metaphor. I think the statement sums it up fairly accurately. I had to stand on this bima the following day and find words that would support and uplift the parents who were staggering into the sanctuary on a Sunday morning, without betraying their trust and allowing them to find the right time and the right words to share it with their children. I call this practice talking over the heads of the children directly to parents. Every time something like this happens, I'm terrified by how good I've become at doing so. I had to control my tears many times since that day, and sometimes I even succeeded. I was uplifted many times when members of this community let me know how much they appreciated my careful choice of words at any given moment, in religious school, during Shabbat and festival services, and in private conversations. I did not always find the right words, and at least on one occasion I fell silent pretty much halfway through the sermon. There were no more words in that moment that were helpful to me. Nothing else I could say, so I fell silent. I've begun to rely on poetry that helped express the pain and the angst and the hope without falling into the trap of providing analysis or predictions or calling for action. I have used music as a language of comfort and love, helping us to deal with our collective and personal emotions. I was heartbroken when I was accused of making people unwelcome at TE. I was stunned that the silent cry of a prayer, "Bring them home," that has been right behind me on the bima for many months now, was perceived by some as a political and divisive statement, making them feel unwelcome in the sanctuary. That praying only for our captives to be returned safely was somehow the betrayal of Jewish values, that every life is valuable and sacred. That praying for Jewish captives' return was somehow a moral failure, unless something else. This year, I shrank a lot. I did not always find the right words. I wasn't always brave enough. I wasn't always strong enough. I was defensive when I shouldn't have been. I, like the rest of my people, have not been whole this entire year. Hillel, in the 1st century, taught us, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? 3 simple statements recorded in Pirkei Avot that convey so much complexity about the world and about the way we interact with it. The first part of the teaching is particularistic in nature. The second part is universalist. And the third simply adds a sense of urgency and encouragement. The second statement is a crucial aspect of modern Reform Judaism, in some ways a foundational one, and indeed a source of great pride. If we only care about ourselves, what do we become? Here's the challenge. We seem to be jumping to the second part of Hillel's teaching way too quickly. What about that first part? Isn't that also important? Just as important? And in the aftermath of October 7th, do we have to acknowledge that skipping straight to the universalist idea embedded within this teaching is plain dangerous? The war in Gaza in the aftermath of October 7th, like any previous escalation in Gaza and Israel, has unleashed a new wave of anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic activity around the world, including right here in the United States. Although the fervor and the scope of it has been unprecedented. Yes, I know the difference between anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. Yes, one can be critical of the actions of an Israeli government, God knows I regularly am, without being accused of being an anti-Semite. But large crowds waving Hamas and now Hezbollah flags around the world in capitals and on university campuses of Western nations, this, despite both organizations clearly defined as terrorist organizations by most of our allies, have very little to do with support for the plight of Palestinian civilians who have suffered for years under the brutal Hamas regime in Gaza, only to be used as human shields by the openly genocidal regime that cares not one tiny bit for its own citizens, or how many of them will die as a result of a brutal war they unleashed on their neighbor. One can care about the innocent lives lost and protest war, any war, even a just war, without preventing Jewish students and professors walk to class on campus, or accusing any Jew who dares to call themselves a Zionist of supporting genocide, as if these two things are in fact equal. When faced with scenes that have played over and over and over in the course of the last year, we do not need to engage in a careful consideration of terminology, but it's fairly obvious to us what this is. In fact, if any other minority group was attacked in such a way on American streets and campuses, we would rightly protest against such attacks and join forces with other Americans of good faith. And we always do. If I am only for myself, what am I? And so we make sure that we show up for others, having internalized the teaching of Hillel so well. In the aftermath of October 7th, the painful and disheartening moments of ostracization became a daily norm. Online, in print, in school, in professional settings. People asking for, compiling, and publishing lists of pediatricians and mental health professionals who are not Zionists was suddenly a norm, not a shanda in a polite conversation. Only a few years ago, many activists were told that they need to disavow their Zionism or leave progressive spaces. Now, the matter shifted further. If you support the idea that Jews are entitled to self-determination, you no longer are welcome, period. There were no communal marches protesting the anti-Semitic attacks, and shows of solidarity in the immediate aftermath of October 7th massacre have quickly turned to tacit approval of both the attitudes and the violence among the otherwise committed progressive folks, which is quite shocking. The very people who are the first to voice their support for any minority under attack do not seem to see verbal and physical violence against the Jews as an abomination because Israel and Zionism. So what is Zionism? The Oxford Dictionary defines it as a movement for originally re-establishment and now the development and protection of a Jewish nation in what is now Israel. It was established as a political organization in 1897 under Theodor Herzl. It is true, not all Jews were Zionists when the idea first emerged, and not all accepted the idea from the start. Many religious authorities opposed the idea of political Zionism since it was a political movement, not God's action, that was going to bring Jews back into the land. Some feared that this idea was going to threaten the lives of Jews in diaspora communities. Yet others believed that it was in fact our destiny to be widespread and not living under the same roof. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 had changed a lot of the thinking, as the situation on the ground has changed. We were no longer talking about a political theory. We were now talking about a country, an actual state with all of the possibilities and all of the challenges that it brings. So today, in 2024, being an anti-Zionist essentially means refusing to allow the Jews a right to self-determination because, you see, we are not doing it right. Let me repeat that. Refusal to accept Israel's existence, expressed as anti-Zionism, is based on the idea that Jews do not deserve a right to self-determination because we cannot be trusted to do it properly. Whether these ideas are expressed by Jews or by non-Jews, I personally find them ludicrous and offensive. I thought that I had finished writing this sermon, but then I listened to and read the coverage on the death of Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, by main voices in our media. AP headline called him charismatic and shrewd longtime Hezbollah leader. The Guardian referred to him as a qualified Islamic scholar, effective public speaker, and competent organizer. New York Times eulogized him by saying that he was opposed to Israel, which he called a Zionist entity, and maintained that there should be one Palestine with equality for Muslims, Jews, and Christians. They actually put that in print. The NPR correspondents were practically gushing with reverence, discussing the towering figure and leader. Not a single acknowledgement of the fact that Hezbollah charter, of which Nasrallah was a creator, calls for the elimination of Israel, and he himself had repeatedly called for, organized, and sponsored, paid for, the murder of Jews. Not to mention the paralyzing stronghold of Hezbollah on the multi-ethnic Lebanon, including the murder in 2005 of Rafik Hariri, Lebanese prime minister, and the continued refusal to allow the parliament to appoint a president that has strangled the country and its economy. Not to mention the murder of hundreds of American and dozens of French soldiers in the terrorist attacks in the 1980s, or the attack on the Jewish center in Buenos Aires in 1994, killing 85 and injuring 300. Plane hijackings, capture and murder of foreign diplomats, capture of Israeli soldiers, or the support of the brutal Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad just a few years ago that killed hundreds of thousands of its own citizens with support from Hezbollah fighters. Not to mention the most recent Hezbollah attack on a soccer field in the north of Israel that killed 12 Druze kids playing a beautiful game. All of this is well known and well documented. Hezbollah is a terrorist organization considered so not just by Israel, but also by the United States and by the United Kingdom and a number of other nations. So how is it that the brutal leader of such an evil force is eulogized as a great community organizer by some of the best opinion makers our communities have to offer? How did the extreme voices from the margins of liberal societies have suddenly become an acceptable mainstream? Part of the twisted answer has to be, since he was fighting Israel, he's the figure of the resistance and is therefore to be celebrated as such. Israel, you see, is the real evil in this world, and thus anyone who attacks it is automatically a hero. This opinion is not new, of course, and yet I'm stunned by the ease with which the pages out of the KGB playbook have now become the standard how-to among opinion makers in the West. Author Dara Horn talks about two types of anti-Semitism. She calls them a Hanukkah anti-Semitism and a Purim anti-Semitism. Purim anti-Semitism is that of Haman. Bent on our destruction, he doesn't really care about what kind of Jews we are, what we think of the world or of each other. He simply sees us as a target, singles us out for destruction, and is so blinded by his hate that he misses a few crucial points and suffers the consequences at the hands of the king-turned-ally. Hanukkah anti-Semitism is different. It is not about denying the Jews a right to exist, not straight away anyway. It is an attempt to destroy the Jewish civilization by making Jews be less Jewish or not Jewish at all. In order to be a part of the world, the Jews had to stop being themselves and become just like everyone else. One of the shocking elements of that story is that Jews who desperately wanted to be part of the wonderful Greek civilization and participate in the games, played of course in the nude, this was Greece, went through, no doubt painful procedure of reverse circumcision. The part that is often missed, that Dara Horn points out, is that there is no historical record that anyone made them do that, even if the fact itself is well documented. That's right. Part of the tragedy of Hanukkah anti-Semitism is the self-erasure of Jews. The world tells us that we can be admitted, but only if we become like everyone else, and yet throughout our history, the Hanukkah anti-Semitism ultimately turns to Purim anti-Semitism that calls for our destruction. This year, the world has demanded a lot of us Jews, and much of it was not pretty. Just 2 weeks ago, there was another encampment on one of the campuses that attempted to force Jews and others to decry Zionism for the right to pass on their way to class, get an armband. To be allowed to walk around the free world in relative safety, we have to give up a part of our Jewish identity. Faced with such tremendous pressure, how easy is it to silence ourselves, to self-erase from the public eye and the public debate? A friend recently quipped that so often those of us trying to hold the world at the center are outshouted by the polar bears who pull the world into margins. I've certainly felt that way for much of this year, falling more and more silent in the face of continued shouting, and dwelling instead on the fate of my fellow Jews kept in the dark of the dungeons of captivity. As a Jew, I hope that my prayer will somehow matter to them. Refusing to accept our people's right to self-determination or question it in the light of profoundly challenging circumstances will not bring about a better world. Giving up on our own national narrative and aspirations and buying wholesale the Palestinian narrative is just as futile as refusing to see the humanity of our Palestinian neighbors. So where do we go from here? Rabbi David Wolpe tells a story about attending the International Convention of BBYO, B'nai B'rith Youth Organization, held in February in Florida. He was on the panel with 3 other presenters, and at the conclusion, the question was posed, what gives you hope? Rabbi Wolpe remarks that his inclination was to say, these 4,000 young Jewish people attending the conference give me hope. Unfortunately for him, that's what the 3 people preceding him on the panel had said. So instead, he provided an alternative answer. He began, I am in a conversation with my great-great-great-great-grandfather. And I say to him, you know, there are anti-Semites causing problems for the Jews at Harvard. And he says to me, there are Jews at Harvard? And then he continues this imaginary conversation. I say to him, yeah, but they hate Israel. And he says, there's an Israel? So Rabbi Wolpe concludes by explaining, we're at the crossroads again. But our ancestors would dream of having the problems that we have. And that doesn't mean that they're not problems. And it doesn't mean that we don't have to address them. And it doesn't mean that it's not crucial. And it doesn't mean that our future is, in different ways, isn't imperiled. All that may be true. But boy, look at where we were and look at where we are. So what awaits us in this new year? What do we mean today when we say Shana Tova to one another? I I do not know. Will this year be any easier? Well, reading reports about Israelis running to shelter in the middle of this night, not just the night before, continued attacks, doesn't look like it, at least not yet. But we are a people filled with hope, and we learn to keep this hope alive even in the face of such adversity. And we work hard to support one another and the rest of Am Israel, the people of Israel, the Jewish people. And we pray for the return of the hostages, those living and those no longer living, so that their families may at least bury them and mourn them. I hope for the day when I can remove the poster from the bima, not because it made someone misrepresent the yearning it conveys, but because the hostages have come home. I hope for the day when the children of this community no longer need armed guards and bomb threat protocols and lockdown drills just because they want to learn Hebrew and celebrate Jewish festivals. Is that too much to ask? And we will not give up on the world either, but we will allow ourselves to cry for our children first, respecting the order of Hillel's wisdom. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? Shana Tova. May it be a good year.